General Vorkath stood with absolute confidence, his many eyes scanning the battlefield projections. The war against humanity had been nothing more than a formality, a mere extension of Zyrixian dominance. Every species before them had fallen in the same way: superior tactics, overwhelming firepower, and an unshakable adherence to the sacred rules of war. There was no reason to believe humans would be any different. Reports suggested they were physically unremarkable, reliant on outdated projectile weaponry and crude mechanized forces. Their adherence to honor-bound treaties was well documented, and their past conflicts followed predictable patterns. A species bound by rules was a species that could be conquered. His fleet descended upon Ralthis IV, a minor human colony of strategic importance. The battle was expected to be over in hours. Zyrixian forces moved in perfect formation, their towering war machines advancing with precision. The humans were outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender was inevitable. As the first waves engaged, Vorkath observed the human response. At first, it seemed routine, standard defensive positions, predictable counterfire. Then, something changed. The battle lines dissolved. The humans abandoned structure entirely. Confusion spread through Zyrixian ranks as enemy soldiers disappeared into the terrain, emerging at unexpected angles, striking in quick, brutal assaults before vanishing again. The structured engagement Vorkath had anticipated never materialized. Instead, the battlefield became chaotic, unpredictable. The humans refused to fight as expected. Reports came in of supply convoys ambushed en route to the front. Entire battalions cut off from reinforcements. Medical ships destroyed without hesitation. This was not how war was fought. There were sacred rules, unspoken agreements across all advanced civilizations. The wounded were not to be targeted. Supply lines were off-limits. Humans disregarded it all. Vorkatha's confidence wavered. He had anticipated a clean victory, not this disorderly slaughter. His forces struggled to regroup, but the humans never allowed them a moment to stabilize. Every countermeasure was met with immediate adaptation. Every defensive position was flanked. Every strategic retreat was met with an ambush. His command center grew eerily silent as his officers processed the chaos unfolding. The enemy did not fight for honor. They fought to win. And in doing so, they had broken every known rule of war. Vorkath watched the reports come in, each more baffling than the last. His forces had superior numbers, superior weapons, and centuries of refined tactics. Yet, against all logic, they were losing ground. The humans refused to meet them in conventional combat, instead striking from shadows, laying traps, and vanishing before a counterattack could be mounted. This was not war. This was something else entirely. Entire outposts went silent overnight. Surveillance drones picked up nothing but empty landscapes, only for squads to walk into perfectly laid kill zones. Communications were intercepted, false orders were issued, and regiments turned on each other in the confusion. Zyrixian forces relied on discipline and structured hierarchy. Humans exploited this mercilessly. A convoy carrying rations and medical supplies was obliterated before it reached the front lines. Not just attacked, systematically dismantled. Explosive devices had been placed with such precision that there was no salvage, no survivors. This was not an accident. Humans understood the cost of war and had no hesitation in starving their enemy. Then came the deception. The enemy surrendered in droves, hands raised in submission. Zyrixian doctrine demanded honorable treatment of captives, so they were processed and secured. Hours later, those same captives tore through security lines from within, turning weapons on their captors. The assault on the main command post wasn't led by an external force, it came from the prisoners who had feigned defeat. The enemy adapted at an impossible pace. Defensive barricades meant to funnel combatants into controlled kill zones were simply ignored. Humans scaled sheer cliffs, cut through dense forests, even tunneled underground to bypass traditional defenses. When orbital bombardments targeted known strongholds, they found nothing but abandoned buildings. The humans had long since moved, leaving traps in their wake. Vorkatha's frustration turned to unease. The rules he had relied on no longer applied. There was no honor in how these creatures fought, no predictable rhythm to their engagements. The battlefield had become a shifting nightmare where the enemy dictated every engagement. His forces were not just being defeated. They were being outmaneuvered, outthought, and outplayed at every turn. Vorkath no longer recognized the war he was fighting. His forces were not just struggling, they were unraveling. The enemy had stripped away any sense of order, forcing his soldiers into a state of perpetual fear. Tactical retreats turned into panicked routes. Veteran commanders hesitated before issuing orders, knowing that every predictable action was a death sentence. His fleet had moved to secure a human colony, expecting civilians to evacuate or surrender. Instead, they fought. Not soldiers, farmers, engineers, children wielding makeshift weapons. His troops hesitated, unprepared for an enemy that refused to recognize its own defeat. Then came the explosions, improvised traps buried under rubble, detonating as soon as his forces advanced. Entire squads vanished in flames before a single shot could be fired. When reinforcements arrived, they found bodies impaled on metal spikes, left in twisted displays. It was not just warfare. It was psychological destruction. Fear spread through the ranks. No soldier wanted to march forward, knowing what awaited them. Even the air felt poisoned with dread. Then came the reports of a bioweapon attack. Zyrixian units deployed in full protective gear, slowing their movements, diverting resources to containment. But no casualties followed. There was no bioweapon. It had been a lie, a manipulation, forcing his forces into a state of paralysis while the real attack struck elsewhere. His soldiers spoke in hushed voices of human resilience. Even the wounded did not stop fighting. Zyrixian doctrine dictated that injuries determined a warrior's effectiveness, yet human soldiers with broken limbs, bullet wounds, and burned flesh still pulled their triggers. Some advanced even after they should have been dead. His warriors whispered about human monsters who refused to fall, who fought beyond pain, beyond reason. The final blow came when his command structure collapsed. His officers were assassinated in their own bunkers, their locations compromised. Tactical data had been fed back to human operatives through a breach in communications. Before he could even process the loss, his battalions were firing on one another. Misinformation had spread so thoroughly that they no longer knew who the enemy was. Vorkath gripped the edges of his war table, his claws digging into the metal. This was no longer a war. It was extermination, and his forces were the prey. Vorkath had exhausted every strategy, every maneuver, every contingency. None of it mattered. His fleet was crippled, his armies scattered, his war machine in ruins. His warriors no longer fought for victory, they fought for survival, clinging to whatever ground they could hold. Even that was slipping away. A final stand was all that remained. He consolidated his remaining forces, fortifying a defensive perimeter around his last operational stronghold. If he could hold out, if he could stall, perhaps reinforcements from the Zyrixian core worlds would arrive. It was a fragile hope, but it was all he had left. The attack never came in the way he expected. There was no grand assault, no overwhelming barrage of firepower. Instead, the lights flickered, the command consoles glitched, and the war machines ground to a halt. Human forces hadn't bombarded his position, they had severed his ability to fight. Communications were cut, targeting systems disabled, energy reserves drained. His forces stood blind and deaf as their weapons failed in their hands. A transmission broke through the silence. The human voice was calm, almost bored. "You thought war had rules. You thought we would fight by them. You were wrong." Vorkatha's claws trembled. Every civilization before had played by the same rules, adhering to the shared codes of engagement. But humans had rewritten the rules entirely. Their warfare was not about proving superiority, it was about ensuring their enemy never had a chance to fight back. The message continued, cold and absolute. Surrender, or your empire ceases to exist. There was no hesitation left. He had seen what they were capable of. He knew what would happen if he refused. With a single command, he ordered the full retreat of Zyrixian forces. Across the battlefield, weapons were lowered, surrender signals broadcast. As he knelt before the human commanders, he no longer saw them as a lesser species. He saw them for what they truly were. The deadliest force the galaxy had ever known.